the Chinese economic and the finance leading group, that is an important group of this Chinese central government, central party, in fact, talk about 4 important points for the country's economy. If I could go through with you about these points: decapacity, financial stability, real estate long-term effective mechanism, last but not least, the manufacturing revitalization. Among these 4 points, which do you think China should have to work extremely hard on?
I would say reducing capacity. Reducing capacity is really about accepting slower growth rate. And excess capacity ultimately is the source of financial instability. So these are very related. I'm quite happy to see the emphasis on these 2 and de-emphasize on GDP growth rate.
Okay. Earlier, when it comes to decapacity, there was quota being sent out through different kinds of local governments. And the state-owned and the non-state-owned, they have to share these quotas. But now it seems there has to be some market mechanism and also later with more enforcement.
Yeah.
How is that going to change the picture?
Well, it's going to be more equitable. For example, if you set an environmental standard, and then you wouldn't rely on administrative measures, because administrative measures quite often result in opposite results.
That's right. It has to be comprehensive. What about for you, Mr. He? Among the 4?
I think the revitalization of the manufacturing sector is of key importance for China. And for a time, some people used to say that it is important to increase the share of service sector in the total economy, which is certainly correct. However, we should not forget that without a strong and modernized manufacturing sector, no China dream can be realized.
Manufacturing sector seems to be the thing that everybody's talking about these days. Even in the United States, Mr. Kennedy, when you listen to the 4 points right before China's National Congress to begin, any of these points do you think will be crucial for China's economy, and where is the U.S. looking at?
Well, certainly this year, addressing overcapacity, revitalizing manufacturing, these are important things to do for this year as part of cyclical problems that China needs to address. But over the long term, marketization, liberalization of the economy is still the key towards making the economy more efficient over the long term. I think people should remember that in terms of manufacturing, China's manufacturing still contributes about 30% of the GDP. In the United States, it's under 10%. So China has already got a strong manufacturing sector compared to just about every other country in the world.
But Mr. He, that has a lot to do with what kind of manufacturing, isn't it?
I think first of all, we should not forget the vast number of sectors in the manufacturing is traditional ones. We should not forget, just stressing that we have to develop high-tech or new emerging industries. These are correct. Still, we should not forget 2 wheels. One wheel is new emerging, the other is traditional. Right. Only when we upgrade the traditional and make it just grow in the long term can we have the modern manufacturing
Interesting
sector.
points. We've already heard different opinions coming from different sides. But this is only one of the things that's really happening regarding China's economic and trade policies. Another thing that we have seen recently is the changes of personnel at some of the key posts. For example, Banking Regulatory Commission, the former Shandong governor now become the chairman. He used to serve as the Regulatory Commission.
Yeah.
Securities. And then there is also the trade minister, Mr. He. You used to work for the Commerce Ministry, and therefore you know Mr. Zhong Shan, a veteran in trade for a long time. Meanwhile, you have seen different kinds of personnel exchanges. What would that mean for China's reform agenda? I think that's what Scott was talking about, isn't it, Mr. He?
And I think, of course, the ministers are important. Nonetheless, they are still performing the directives and decisions by the central government and the party central committee. And as far as Zhong Shan is concerned, he used to be a business executive in the province, and later he became the department chief for commerce, then the vice governor and the vice minister of commerce, and then trade representative, until now he became the minister.
So really the insider.
Yes,
that are
he's
now
the
in
veteran.
the position.
He has been in the trade sector for dozens of years and decades.
So knows it inside out. I guess also the chairman of now the Banking Regulatory Commission, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think that's a very interesting appointment because Mr. Guo used to run used to be running the security watchdog, and after that he was managing one of the most important industrial province in China. So if you see what has happened in past few years, what do we see is this mismatch between market development and regulation. So I think you need someone who can understand banking, insurance, security, so on and so forth.
And also
Because
the local
ultimately-
governments.
Yes, because ultimately, I think what China is likely to do is to create a super architecture.
Well, the two of you have been extensively explaining some of the changes
Yeah.
of personnel here in China. Mr. Kennedy, I have to go to you about the changes of personnel at some of the key trade positions. For example, the Commerce Secretary just confirmed in the United States, 79 years old, Mr. Ross, billionaire, but he early supporter of President Trump and has been talking about the lower middle class in the U.S. What would that mean for trade policy?
Well, the appointment of Wilbur Ross is helping to round out the cabinet. There are still a few other positions to fill, but it's important. In the U.S., it probably takes a little bit more time for appointments than it does in China, and certainly if Wilbur Ross was in China, given his age, he probably wouldn't have been appointed based on the rules that China has for retirement. But he's got a wealth of experience. I think he's going to be focusing on promoting American exports, on American manufacturing, a lot of the things that we've heard from the Trump administration. But I still think there's a lot that's unclear about where American economic policy is broadly going. We'll learn a little bit tonight when the president speaks before Congress for the first time. But I think his appointment should be seen as a positive sign.
All right. Well, there's another one, which is the trade representative. That is Robbin Latoya. He has been attorney. Also, Mr. Kennedy, he has been well known for, in fact, letting South Korea, Japan, Mexico to reduce so-called cheap steel exports to the United States during the Reagan administration when he was the vice trade representative. Is he likely to repeat his cause once again toward China?
I think that's probably a good bet. The U.S. Trade Representative's job is to protect American industry through the use of trade, through bringing trade cases, also negotiating trade deals. It's clear that the Trump administration isn't satisfied with multilateral efforts, even though people like myself and others think TPP would have been good, not just for the U.S., but for China and others. But nevertheless, in an administration that's going to be using a lot of carrots and sticks, Mr. Lighthizer is probably going to be the one holding a lot of the sticks.
Carrots and sticks. Already you talk about it, so let's put that onto the table. According to the recent meeting between the Chinese State Councilor Yang Jiechi and the U.S. President Donald Trump, here's what we have. They both agree to cooperate on bilateral, regional, and global issues, and also exchanges at all levels from top down. Meanwhile, talking about cooperative relationship. Is that, Mr. He, likely to reflected in the trade relations?
I think this is of key importance regarding trade, because cooperation and means that both sides should try to avoid conflict. For a couple of months when after Donald Trump was elected the president, there has been plenty of talks about the pending trade war between the U.S. and China. That means that the two countries are doomed to conflict because of the vast differences on trade. But this keystone is we try to avoid conflict. We should negotiate to talk.
Is that really what the U.S. has in mind? And President Trump was talking about using it as a bargaining chip, whatever can be put on the so-called negotiation table, Mr. Kennedy.
I think you should look more broadly, not just at President Trump, but the broad political climate in Washington following China thinks the relationship has been unfair for several years and needed to be changed. President Trump just represents one of those opinions. The favorite word in Washington today is reciprocity, equal treatment. And if you look at investment openness in the two countries, it isn't uneven. Chinese companies can invest in many sectors in the United States with no ownership caps, where American companies don't have the same opportunities in China. So I think they're looking for greater reciprocity. To some extent, they'll probably bring more pressure than the Obama administration did. But I think even if you had seen a third Obama administration, you probably would have seen a scratchier relationship from the U.S. side. But I think at the end of the day, the goal is to get beyond these difficulties in the relationship and pursue a win-win partnership.
Reciprocity, equal treatment, those words can be objective rather than subjective.
Yes, but reciprocal also means a huge opportunity for China, because in certain area, we are likely to see immense pressure coming from Trump administration. Happen to be the area China can gain tremendously by opening up the market.
But there's a degree, isn't it?
Well, for example, healthcare, for example, pharmaceutical industry, and to a certain extent, financial industry, insurance, so on and so forth. So, but I do believe this is China's trump card, market access in a meaningful way.
Well, you have been an open gator for a long time, I know, Mr. Xu. What about for you, Mr. He?
Yes, I fully support further opening up in China. We should open our door wider, welcoming the foreign investors and all the good resources from different parts of the world, including the United States. This is absolutely what we are looking for.
But it also takes step by step, isn't it? As some would argue.
Of course, we have a lot of debates and different opinions in the country and different sectors. We have to do a lot of work. And also we have to move step by step after some pilot Zoom experiences. Then if we have successful experiences, then we can popularize it to different parts, other parts of the country, and then we can do it.
There are two things, in fact, with the Trump administration. Whether there is likely to be the possibility everything has to be renegotiated. That's going to be mind-boggling and also stressful. Secondly, is whether there's going to be any trade war. If either side do not agree with one another on certain issues. A trade war between China and the United States has been talked a lot recently in media at least, yet economists doubt the two countries can really afford a war. This is their reasoning. According to the section 122 in the Trade Act of 1974 in the United States, the president shall proclaim for a period of not exceeding 150 days a temporary import surcharge not to exceed 15% also of the original amount in the form of duties. That's in fact in the law on articles imported into the United States. But Mr. Kennedy, we know President Trump has been a very unique personality. Whether his team is going to be aggressive enough to push the Capitol Hill to change things, including the law and sections regarding the trade, that's going to be an interesting issue, isn't it?
It certainly will, and you know, he's got a big agenda on domestic economic policy, foreign economic relations. There is a lot of things that he can do unilaterally by declaring a state of emergency and issuing executive orders. He can adjust American tariff rates almost at will before Congress would step in or others. Some of these things could be challenged at the WTO, but we know the WTO moves at a pretty glacial pace. And so I still expect him probably not to depend on across-the-board type of adjustments like the one you described, but more targeted use of American trade remedy laws, countervailing duties, subsidy on anti-dumping, also limiting access potentially to Chinese investment through the use of national security regulations or other types of adjustments. So that's probably the way he's likely to go rather than seek things through congressional approval.
We are seeing some footages when President Trump was meeting with the Canadian and the Mexican counterparts. Certainly a lot of stress over there. Mr. He, what about China's preparation? If one side takes certain actions, will China tit for tat?
It depends on the situation, whether that action
You
is,
sound like a great trade negotiator, sir.
is reasonable. Because if they say that the Chinese steel exports to U.S. was undercutting the U.S. price and they have to impose some tariffs, then we have to negotiate on this specific case. If they impose across the board a certain amount of surcharge, then we will certainly resort to WTO. And I'm not sure that the United States will lose.
But even with going to WTO, what if the U.S. doesn't want to participate and doesn't want to follow the rules of the WTO?
I don't think so. They will. I think during my service in the Chinese consulate general in New York in 2002, the George W. Bush imposed a 10% surcharge on all the steel imports into the U.S. to protect the domestic steel industry. Then European Union, Russia, Japan, Korea, and China resorted to WTO, and finally the United States lost case, and George W. Bush said, okay, we will change that.
So your point is that Mr. Trump is likely to follow in that footstep?
It depends on the specific case, whether that's reasonable.
We'll see whether that's going to happen. Mr. Xu, before we go, in fact, we're not just talking about the war, quote unquote, or the reform within our own societies, whether it's China or the United States, when it comes to trade and economic structures, but rather how can we merge these two together?
Yeah.
Internal improvements and changes, while at the same time work with one another to find the best solution of cooperation. Is there some inspiration you can share with us before we go?
I think we should take President Trump seriously, although we may not take him literally. I think some sort of adjustment through trade is likely to happen. I don't see a trade war, but major trade frictions cannot be discounted.
All right, Mr. Kennedy, final words from you. Should we prepare for the worst, hope for the best?
I think you're going to need to do both. Things are still highly uncertain, and there's also the possibility that Trump will get bogged down on his domestic agenda or political issues. So there's still, just about anything is possible. I do think it's a time of change. Both economies need to adapt and figure out how to address their own domestic issues while strengthening the relationship, if at all possible.